Hi, I'm here with Raymond Bradley, the author of God's Gravediggers, and he's a well-known debater and philosopher. Welcome, Ray.
Yes, that's correct.
First, I want to ask you. You mentioned in your book your experience growing up and for the abuse and the experiences you had when you started showing your tendency for free thought, right?
Yes, okay.
Do you think?
That's the sort of question I might have expected from another free thinker.
Yeah. So, like, I'm curious. What do you think would have been different in your path towards free thought had you not experienced this much backlash from a community?
I don't think I'd have developed very differently because most of my problems, as seen by my parents, arose from their inability and the inability of specialists to whom they referred me to answer questions cogently and without specious argument. I was, I might add, brought up as a fundamentalist, as a fervent fundamentalist, as a Baptist, in a long line of ancestors who numbered among their qualifications those of being ministers, missionaries, etc., going right back to the parents-in-law of the famous African missionary David Livingstone in Africa.
Okay, so you're. Okay. It wouldn't change much, you're saying, in.
No, it wouldn't change much. My problems, as they saw it, arose from my disposition to question and not to accept as acceptable answers the sort of crap, if I may describe it that way, that my parents and clergymen and evangelists offered me by way of reply.
Okay, so it might be obvious to us, being fellow free thinkers, like these questions and the answers that they put forth are clearly not sufficient, right? But I'm curious, what do you think has taken humanity so long? What is it about humans, like, since the time of Epicurus, right? He has this famous quote about God. Is he not omnipotent? Why call him God? Is he not benevolent? Then he is malicious. Something to this effect, right? And this is a very concise argument that should have killed the concept of God from the start. But what do you think is keeping humanity from getting over these notions of supernatural beings?
Well, I think there are two things. First, the disposition of humans to look for superstitious answers, supernatural answers. When something occurs which can't readily be attributed to the agency of humans, for example, floods, tsunamis, droughts, volcanic explosions, etc., they obviously aren't caused by humans, so they presuppose that there must be some agent, and if not a natural agent like a human, then a supernatural agent to whom they can be attributed.
And the other thing, you said there were two?
The second thing is the institution of religion, which stems from that first factor. And the injunction, the habit of indulging in faith. That is, in belief that tends to be, what's the word? Intractable.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah, that'll do.
So
it's not quite what the word I was thinking of, but it'll do.
So it's basically the need to have an agent behind everything, and the institutions.
Yes.
Okay.
That's what I'm suggesting.
Okay. Being a free thought community, the Filipino freethinkers are well known for speaking out against religious dogma. But recently we've found ourselves going into the political scene, talking about secularism, human rights, and so on. And oftentimes we get remarks that say, if you're free thinkers, this isn't about religion, why are you talking about this? Like, what other institutions or areas of human study do you think free thought is sorely needed nowadays?
Well, I would think against any faith-based set of beliefs, including religious dogmas, not just religious dogmas, but scientific dogmas, political dogmas, social dogmas, etc. Wherever there is dogma to be believed, then free thought is taboo.
Are there other areas where you have exercised free thought aside from religion, where you have been called out for?
Yes, indeed. Back in the 1960s was the period when New Zealand first got involved in the Vietnam War. I was very opposed to that and appeared on television debating various people and became known as not just an atheist, but a dissident in more general terms. I happened to play a role in Auckland, the biggest city in New Zealand, in Auckland's biggest demonstration, a so-called sit-in. And I can remember well on a following weekend going up skiing and being greeted at the top of the first chairlift by, "Oh, you're that SOB who doesn't believe that we should go to Vietnam. You're also an atheist." And that was sufficient indictment for me to be fired from the committee of the ski club that I was a member of.
Oh, that was unfortunate. But so free thinkers like us, we do get a lot of flack around the world because there are a lot of dogmatic institutions the world around.
Yeah.
Do you think that the internet plays a big role in helping free thinkers like find communities or even learn about, for example, philosophical arguments against these superstitious beliefs?
Yes, I do. On the other hand, I'm somewhat averse to the phenomenon of, social media. Yeah, which tend to distort and propagate falsehoods.
Could you expound on like how does it propagate falsehoods? But we could also propagate truth through social media, right? But
it can, yeah. But the falsehoods tend to go unchecked.
So basically, you're saying that because skepticism is not like the default for human thinking, is this what you're saying?
Yes,
it's easier.
That's a good way of putting it.
Okay, okay. So you also mentioned in your book that religion, you compared it to something like a virus, so to speak. So if it's a
The
virus
virus
of
of
the
the
mind,
mind.
yes.
Yes, that's
What would
how
be
Richard Dawkins
yeah?
described it.
What would be the best vaccine that you would recommend for helping people avoid getting infected over and over again throughout the generations?
I guess asking questions and not being content to go for spurious answers.
So it's basically
Asking,
okay, go ahead. Sorry.
asking questions and pursuing them as far as they will go. The spirit of inquiry is absolutely essential, I think, to dealing with what Richard Dawkins called the virus of the mind.
Okay. With religion, however, do you think that there is a spectrum for harm? Like you mentioned that of course religion in general is harmful, but would you say that some religions are more harmful than others?
Yes, I would. Currently, I think that the so-called Islamists are casting a very dark shadow on human history. Mind you, that many of their injunctions, e.g., to slay the infidels, are paralleled in biblical passages which are or should be believed by literalists of Judaic, Christian, and Islamic religions.
I see. How about what would be the least harmful religion that you know of?
Well, it's debatable as to whether it even counts as a religion, but I would say Buddhism
Buddhism.
would be a case in point. Though there are fundamentalists there who persecuted the Hindus, especially in the parts of the world where they cohabit. I can't think off the top of my head of any other relatively innocuous religion. They tend all to come with their doctrines and dogmas and to eschew, avoid questioning.
If you wouldn't classify Buddhism as a religion, what would you prefer to call it?
None.
Okay. So would it,
Absolutely no religion. I found when I read a book called The Life of the Buddha, which I won at an essay prize at secondary school, that I admired many of the doctrines put forward by Gautama, the founder of Buddhism, but I couldn't accept many others.
so like I think you mentioned in the book that you did not accept reincarnation, right? Because there was no evidence.
That's right, yeah. It seemed to me to be totally preposterous to believe that human beings and other conscious creatures could come back to Earth in some other form.
What would you say to the argument put forth by a lot of people that, oh, if you believe in these kinds of things, which there is no evidence for, maybe this helps people become better or more pro-social in their treatment of others? Would you say that that's a benefit that's worth the cost of lying or of deception, self-deception?
Well, I will admit readily that many subscribers to various religions live noble lives. But the more fundamentalist of them perpetrate indignities and harm to others, albeit even if it's only in the form of censure of their other dissident brothers and sisters.
Okay. You mentioned also in your book, you touched lightly on moral philosophy. What areas of life do you think people can apply moral philosophy immediately? And if they studied moral philosophy, they would find things they would be unacceptable in the way they currently live, that for the average person.
State that question again.
So if people studied moral philosophy, what do you think would they most easily find in their daily activities that they're morally required to change?
Well, it depends on what moral philosophy you're talking about. Kantian moral philosophy or John Stuart Mill's, they all have precepts which are worth acknowledging and following.
But is it for you? Is there a particular philosophy that you follow? Is there a label that you attach to yourself, or do you avoid that?
My position is to do good to others and avoid doing evil as far as is possible within the constraints of one's legal system and one's culture.
By evil, you mean harm, right?
Yes.
Yes, because evil can be misconstrued, with the religious language.
Of course it can. I was looking just before you phoned at a translation of Isaiah, what is it now? Isaiah chapter 15, I think it is, or 7, I forget which says, summing it all up, that the Lord says, I create evil. Now that passage creates many problems for fundamentalists. So you get substitutions of near equivalent synonyms, such as I create disaster, I create calamity, I create woe, etc. These are alternate translations which you'll find in alternate translations to that of the King James Version, which comes out straightforwardly and says evil. But of course, calamity, woe, etc., are all themselves forms of, because natural forms of, so-called evil. If within theology you distinguish between revealed theology and natural theology, you'll find that there are kinds of evil known as moral evils by way of contrast with natural evils.
Okay. So there's a lot of room for interpreting the word evil, right? At least in the religious sense. Yeah. Okay. You also mentioned in your book that something like Santa Claus and Tooth Fairy are like practice for children with regard to skepticism, right?
Yes.
And they go into adulthood failing to apply the same skepticism which they did to these other things. What do you think is the huge difference between between the Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the gods?
Well, Santa Claus, Tooth Fairy, Santa Claus, and the gods are Well, all of them are equally myths. That is, widely accepted falsehoods. To put the point personally, in my first chapter, which is in effect a biographical sketch of my upbringing and my transition from fundamentalism to free thinking, I subtitled that chapter, "It All Began with Santa." And in effect, that is how it was. I was taken as a child of 5 or 6 to various shops around Auckland and introduced to various Santas, all men with big white beards, and I wanted to know which was the true Santa. Now, that had its reflection in the fact that I wanted to ask and demanded to ask of my parents, what is the true religion? We happen to live across the road from a family of Roman Catholics. On one occasion, while playing with the Catholic kids, I gashed my knee very severely. My mother chided me for having played with the Catholics with contempt. I bear the scar on my knee to this very day, nearly 80 years later. And I replied, but aren't they Christians too? And she said, yes, but they're not true Christians. They follow the whore of Rome, with tones of vituperation in her voice. So that sowed the question in my mind, if there are true Christians, then am I sure that the Christianity that I'm being taught is the true religion, or are all others false? How about Baptists? Maybe they're false religion too. So hence the skepticism that characterized my upbringing and my teens and especially my late 20s.
I want to ask you. So you ask them the question like, are they also Christians, right? Which kind of broadens the the sphere of compassion to more people, right?
Yeah.
There's a similar trend. For example, there's a group called Unitarian Universalists, who are still more or less theists, but they are averse to having specific religious labels attached to them, and they are more accepting of other people so long as they are, more or less theistic. What do you think of this, and do you think it's a good thing, or do you think it's somewhat dishonest to try to keep that theism and not move forward into agnosticism or atheism?
Well, if I can correct you slightly, universalism is a position adopted by many, those who show compassion for their fellow Christians, which would modify the doctrine that Jesus himself taught, which was of the fate in hell awaiting those who don't believe in him. Universalists believe that all believers will eventually go to heaven. They're contrasted with the annihilationists, so-called, who would teach that Jesus or God, if you're going to distinguish between the two, will annihilate all those at death who don't believe. But neither doctrine is well encapsulated in the New Testament.
Okay, so there's flaws in both of them.
Yes.
Okay.
By the way, I'd like to come back to the question that I think you asked me earlier as to what position in general I would take with respect to religion and morality. And my answer would be empathy and compassion, both of which I believe are the roots of morality and ought to be reflected in religious doctrines.
So, going back to morality, we're both aware that morality stems from our social nature, right, as primates, and it was an evolved characteristic, our sense of morality. I think we're in agreement with that. Do you think, however, that there may be some kind of study of morality that can be made more objective, like formalized, and that can be a generalized theory of morality, so to speak? Do you think that there can be something like that?
Well, let me put it more or less negatively. I believe that any moral doctrine that does not allow for empathy and compassion is an immoral doctrine. And by the way, it's not just primates who exhibit empathy and compassion. You find it among other species, including, for example, elephants and birds.
So basically, any creature that has evolved to be social in its survival.
Yes, correct.
Okay. I think we're almost out of time, so I just want to ask. Let's see. One more question. Okay. I want to ask you about monotheism and polytheism. What your opinion of the differences between them are. In particular, how the adherents treat other people. For example, how monotheists treat polytheists and how polytheists treat monotheists. Do you have a particular observation about this?
Well, so far as traditional monotheism is concerned, and I'm restricting that term to Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, all of which reject the polytheist beliefs. I believe they tended to be the more vicious religions that we've so far been blessed with, as it were. We've so far been cursed with. Polytheism, by way of contrast, especially as practiced in the Roman Empire, was very tolerant of a multiplicity of gods, a multiplicity of forms of worship. And initially, the Roman Empire just regarded Judaism and its successor, Christianity, as just other religions to be tolerated as pleasant fantasies.
So, if seeing that polytheists in general treat others in a better way,
in a more compassionate way?
Yeah, more compassionately. Would you welcome a shift from monotheism to polytheism in the modern age? Or what would your thoughts be about that?
No, I wouldn't, because the polytheists tended to assign supernatural agency to the causes of various natural phenomena in the form of disasters and diseases, etc., and they curbed the progress of knowledge and the quest for truth.
Okay. So you think like we might fall back from the scientific method a little bit?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. Okay. I think that's all the time we have. Thank you very much, Raymond.